Hey, welcome to the Texas Legislative Update. I'm David Blackman, and I'm here with Jason Modglin, the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. Jason, how was your week?
Good. It was a long week. We Sine died at the legislature and then convened right back the very next day for a special session that the governor called. And then the House promptly Sine died that same day. So it's it's been quite a few balls up in the air as we're waiting to see what they in fact do on the special session and then starting to get into some interim activities at the Railroad Commission.
Yeah. So this is our 19th episode. This is our session review episode. It is over, but it's still going in a special session form. We've got this standoff right now happening on the property tax issue. Governor Abbott has weighed in favor of the plan that the House passed before it adjourned sine die, and but the Senate doesn't appear to be too happy with that plan. So tell us how this is all going to go.
Well, it's anyone's guess how this is going to go. Uh, the number one item going into the session was how to dispense with the $32.7 billion budget surplus. And the governor put out a marker pretty early on during session to say that he wanted to see at least half go towards property tax relief. And the Senate started quickly as they always do with a very bold property tax proposal, which was to raise homestead exemptions for both homeowners under 65 as well as homeowners over 65, and couple that with school tax rate compression. It would have saved homeowners quite a bit of money, would have saved businesses a little bit of money, and a great plan. The House had a different plan in mind. Rather than doing homestead increases, they wanted to do the school compression, but then they wanted to go back to something that has been talked about at the legislature since Wayne Pivotal put into effect the property tax code in the 80s, is some form of appraisal cap,
Yeah.
so that your appraisal can't grow faster, or excuse me, your taxable value can't grow faster than what it is appraised at, and that being a percentage cap. And so the House suggested that a 5% across the board appraisal cap on both residential and industrial commercial property was appropriate. That did not fly in the Senate, and so there was kind of an impasse. And so as they adjourned Monday at the end of session, they did not have the property tax bill in place, and the governor promptly called him back. They also had a few border security items that had unfortunately not passed during the regular session in the House due to some points of order. And so they had to come back for that as well. So the governor had two items on his call: property tax relief and border security or human trafficking type issues. Um, so when they gavelled in on Tuesday morning, the House, in kind of record fashion, dispensed with all of their business in the same day. They almost never do that,
How
and
did that
so
happen?
well, this happens quite a bit in the Senate. Is
Yeah.
they'll suspend the Constitution, which is just a phenomenal parliamentary procedure, because our Constitution is set up very much like our needs were 150 years ago, where we need time to travel to Austin to express our viewpoints. Well, now that time has shrunk pretty considerably. And so what they've done is that they would hear a bill, they would immediately recess, send it to committee, allow that committee to vote it out, no public testimony, and then bring it back up on the floor, vote it on second reading, and then suspend the rules in the Constitution, voted on third reading. So the House, in record time, accomplished all of their business for the special session on Tuesday, and adjourned. Sine die. They said, we're done. We're going home. The Senate had acted a little earlier in the day to do their property tax item, which includes the homestead increases. But that's not exactly what's on the governor's call, and it's kind of it's certainly up to both legislative houses and their parliamentarians to decide what is germane to that call, what they're going to hear on the floor. When the House received the Senate bills, they made a determination that those bills were not germane to the call. So they actually sent them back to the Senate. And then, of course, they voted their bills out, sent those to the Senate. And so it was a bizarre ship passing in the night, if you will. The Senate had adjourned until this morning, Friday morning. This is when we're recording this, and they came in. They received the House bills, but they didn't send them to committee. And so we're in this a bit of standoff right now on property taxes. The governor's plan, which is what ultimately he asked for, what the House passed, is different than what we discussed during the regular session. It is entirely a school tax rate compression. So today, on average, school tax rates across the state in the maintenance and operation portion is 91 cents. There's a few outliers, but that's the average. What this plan would do is drop that to 64 cents, a very considerable amount and reduction, 17 cents.
It's a 30% reduction.
And so that, we signed on to a letter that Texas Alliance of Energy Producers did this week, where a number of business and homeowner associations, advocacy groups, think tanks said we're supporting, we're endorsing this plan to compress the school tax rate. So that we'll see what the Senate ultimately ends up doing. They're coming back in next Tuesday, and we'll see ultimately how they dispense. Otherwise, I would suspect the governor would call them right back. I mean, this was the number one issue going into the regular session. You can't do other things. I think it's hard to sign a budget. It's hard to sign other types of big legislation dealing with property taxes or dealing with economic incentives if you're not addressing kind of broad tax relief and particularly relief for homeowners. So he's in a bit of a tight spot. Now, they're all in a tight spot.
They all are. Yeah.
You got to get this done. Yeah.
Well, speaking of other high priority issues, another one going into the session was to get a replacement for Section 313, which had expired. House Bill 5 became the vehicle for that. That bill passed, and that will have impacts on energy related projects, right? With property tax abatement kinds of incentives for energy related projects.
It certainly will. There's been a number of times where refineries in the state, very large transmission facilities, pipeline facilities have accessed those funds. Here recently, they've been used a lot for data centers and other types of very large processing and distribution centers. Think of like a Walmart or an Amazon distribution center. But a lot of the criticism had been on wind and solar projects receiving those funds. They don't bring a lot of kids with them. That they don't bring a lot of permanent jobs with them, and they also have some really good incentives from the federal government. And so it was throwing money at something that is basically already free now. There's not a lot of ability to go to another state. You're in kind of a prime spot, and we're the only state with the transmission and with the wind profile or the solar profile for where you want to invest, again, to capture as much of those federal incentives as possible. So there was rightful criticism of the program, and it expired at the end of last year, 2022. And so lots of groups came together and said, how do we increase the level of transparency? How do we continue to require that level of information and transparency for not only taxpayers, but also for elected officials so that they can see what types of programs are being approved here. But then put a legislative stamp on it that we want a certain level of capital investment. We want a certain level of jobs. And then the Senate really, I thought, put in a pretty innovative approach to the idea is that you should scale this based on the population of the counties. So smaller counties could have smaller investments in them, could have smaller job requirements, but still be able to abate 50% of the value of that facility, whereas counties above $1 million would have a higher requirement in place. And so while I was very nervous last week, I think I told you I suspected that Chairman Hunter would just accept the Senate changes. They went to conference, and I was worried that conference, the time might run out a little
Right,
bit.
yeah.
But thankfully, the conference completed their business fairly quickly and was able to get it back to both chambers and get the bill passed. So that's on the way to the governor. But like I said, the governor needs to sign the broad property tax legislation before this one becomes law. I mean, just visually, that's a critical first step. So I still worry about this bill a little bit, given that we don't have a final property tax bill in place.
Yeah, optics are important in all
That's
this. Another good bill, hopefully, for the grid and energy in Texas is Senate Bill 2627, which also passed along with SJR 93. And there will be a ballot issue in November that will hopefully pass. And tell us what that bill does.
Yeah, so that bill provides for either a low interest loan, and originally it was going to be a very low interest, but they came up to closer to prime on that. But it would allow for a low interest loan for building new electricity dispatchable facilities. Or it provides for a completion bonus. So if a project is being worked on today or in the very near future, it already has its financing. It could still, if it meets the completion timeline, which is a very short window, it's either 3 or 4 years, then they could be eligible for a completion bonus. Hopefully that means bringing it online a little quicker, a little sooner. It is dependent upon voters approving it in November. As we've talked about a few times, this is going to be an expensive ballot election, with the first hopefully being your property tax relief. But then there's going to be quite a few other items on there, ranging from electricity to water, parks, you name it. There's going to be quite a plethora of spending options for voters, and that always worries me a little bit on bond elections, things of that nature. But November elections, it, it's anyone's game. That it's
Yeah.
such a low turnout election, that hopefully everyone's showing up to vote for property tax relief. But then we'll see what happens after that. The Secretary of State basically draws numbers for the order of the ballot. And so
Yeah. Out of a
uh,
hat, right? Yeah.
it is just completely random as to the order of the ballot. And property taxes are buried somewhere deep in there. You might have some no's before you get to the yes. I don't know.
Right.
It's going to be a wild November.
Uh, Also had some sunset bills that were up this time. Those passed. I think we're in good shape there, right? Which commissions
Yeah,
were up?
some key reforms to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Very happy to see that bill passed and onto the governor's desk. That's a critical one for the oil and gas industry in the state, but really any industrial practice in the state. The Public Utility Commission and ERCOT and OPUC is part of the umbrella under the Public Utility Commission. That passed as well. That's largely where most of the reforms for the performance credit mechanism were put in. It is into that sunset report. There'll be some good transparency measures there at ERCOT to report on market conditions. And so I think that's probably where both the House and Senate agreed that that's where their stamp on the PCM should take place. And so that's a positive step to get to the governor's desk as well.
Good. And of course, back to the elephant in the living room again this week. The impeachment of Attorney General Ken Paxton whipped right through the House on an overwhelming 121-19 vote or something like that.
Yeah.
A very bipartisan vote, it should be noted. And, now we have a trial in the Senate. Have you heard anything about expectations for how long people are expecting a Senate trial to last?
Yeah. So, yes, it did pass on Saturday, right after we recorded last
Yeah.
week, and 121 votes in the House. It then moved to the Senate. The Senate adopted a resolution to basically plan out the trial, what that would look like. The House has the ability to appoint House managers, and so they've appointed a number of House members from across the state, and bipartisan there, but really quite a range, if you will, of elected officials. You had very conservative Republicans on there, more moderate Republicans, and then conservative and very liberal Democrats. So quite the range on that House managers list. And then yesterday, they announced that they had brought on some outside counsel, which
Yeah.
I don't know.
Some heavy
I,
hitters.
I still don't know what to make of it. But Rusty Hardin and Dick DeGuerin, famed criminal defense lawyers.
Well, and Rusty
And
was a prosecuting attorney for like 17 years in Houston too. So,
mhm, mhm.
he's been on both sides of these things.
Um,
That's a couple of very powerful law firms to get involved in this.
very powerful attorneys. I mean, well respected in the legal community. But this is not in a courtroom, so this
Yeah.
is very much in the court of public opinion, and they certainly have worked in that space quite a bit. But then it's also in front of a political body in the Senate. So it remains to be seen how this trial will look. The resolution that Dean Whitmire, who's the senior senator from Houston, a Democrat, also running for mayor
Yeah.
here fairly quickly, is to come up with a process by which the Senate will lay out a trial schedule. They're supposed to initiate that trial before the end of August. So they've got a timeline in place, at least for a deadline. We'll see how quickly they start on that. And then it remains to be seen how long it will go.
Yeah.
The Attorney General also announced that a number of his staff had taken a leave of absence, and they would in fact be conducting the defense in the Senate. So these are also key people for the state of Texas. I mean, the Solicitor General, which is our, separate and apart from the Attorney General and the first Attorney General, our Solicitor General is who goes to the Supreme Court and
Right.
advocates on our behalf, who is the chief litigator for the state of Texas. So a key and important attorney, and so he's taking a leave and is going to work on the defense. So it it'll be wild. Is all I can say. In a session of first, this year will just continue going on, and either July or August we'll have this trial, and I mean it'll be must see TV for folks around this building, around this process.
Well, it was a session of firsts and quite a few of them. You want I know you were keeping a list. Do you want to talk about some of the other things you never thought you'd see that happened in this session?
Well, I mean, first is got to be the budget surplus. I mean, $32.7 billion budget surplus. Somebody pointed out to me this week that exceeds the annual budgets of over 23 states, which is just unbelievable.
Well, and meanwhile, California's got a $44 billion deficit. So,
and then the exact opposite direction. That is just it's one, it's phenomenal, but two, it's just it's so out there. We're just not going to see that level of surplus, I think, for quite a while, and
yeah.
until we have another banner year where we've got both federal monies coming in, we've got record high oil and gas revenues. We've also got record high sales tax revenues, coming off the pandemic, and everybody's ready to spend and go. So it seems quite the perfect storm this session. With that $32.7 billion, they were able to do a lot of things in the budget that they had really always said that they could never do or never engage in, for lack of funds and really a lack of political will, if you will,
Yeah.
for doing those items. And so they've made a good effort this session to raise employee pay, state employee pay across the board. It was a 5% pay increase across the board to state employees. They also put in there parental leave, which is just is quite a change of pace, and I thought it was remarkable, because that's such a different approach than what they
Yeah.
typically
A lot
had
different.
on those types of issues. That also afforded them the ability, that budget surplus afforded them the ability to create the Texas University Fund. For over 100 years, we've had the public university fund, which is affectionately called the PUF, but West Texas lands that, and we celebrated the Santa Rita #1 this past Saturday, 100 years, or Sunday, excuse me. Of providing that oil and gas revenue, that severance tax revenue and royalties into the state. It created and funded the University of Texas and Texas A&M university systems. But we have other university systems in the state, notably Texas Tech, University of Houston, and then the Texas State system. and they had never had their own endowment.
Right.
And so the legislature set aside $3 billion as a perpetual endowment for those universities. So just a pretty remarkable in terms of surplus and budget. But then couple that with the House hasn't expelled a member in 50 years. That occurred this session. And then the state hasn't been engaged in an impeachment process in over 100 years for a
104 years. Yeah.
statewide elected official. And so that occurred this session as well. And then if we had a bingo card and we said at the beginning of the session that what they would get stuck on the special session would be property taxes, I would never have taken that bet. I mean, I would have lost. So quite the just remarkable twists and turns in this process. It's been quite a 6 months.
Yeah, really has. It's an absolutely amazing session. And I wasn't directly involved in it like you were, but it was fun to talk about at the end of each week. Yeah, this impeachment thing with Paxton, man, that's going to be big news all summer. And I think the Republicans ought to be a little concerned about the blowback it's going to create on their party politically, just from a public image standpoint. But
Sure.
I mean, I think it's an interesting dynamic here that I guess the members of the party in the House are willing to take that risk to do what they think is the right thing. And the timing of it's weird, but it's just the way it is. Anyway, it's been an incredibly remarkable session. I know that there's been a lot of conflicts between the big three Republican leaders of the state as well throughout the session, and that's not really unusual, or hasn't been over the years. So anyway, it's been a lot of fun, and just so everyone knows, Jason and I talked about it, and we're going to continue doing this podcast in the interim between sessions, but on a monthly basis. And it'll be, we'll record it as a once a month episode of my regular podcast that I host, which is the Energy Question. So it'll have graphics and actual real production and stuff, because things won't be quite as time sensitive during the interim as they have been during the heat of the legislative session. So I've really enjoyed this, Jason. I really appreciate you doing it, man. I know it's a big time sink for you, and I just your knowledge about all this just demonstrates how well represented the Texas Alliance is in Austin.
Well, I appreciate that. It's been a help for me too. Is what did I actually do this week? And when you're running on little sleep and other things, that's always an important thing to look back and say what happened this week and what's happening next week. So I really enjoyed that. And as we've talked about a number of times over the years, when we used to do a radio program, it's so important that we have voices out there talking about energy issues and what's facing us. It's not as simple as switching to green energy or relying on whatever's coming out of that plug. There's quite a bit of work that takes place behind the scenes by our regulators, by very large industries, but also by mom and pops that are out there that are creating a product that is globally traded. So it's a pleasure having these conversations and then able to have them on podcast and have people be able to access them. And I continue to get people coming up and saying, I'm listening to the podcast. So it's great.
The audience has grown literally with every episode. And So that's good. It's just a good sign that it's being noticed, and we haven't, we don't have a budget for promoting it. Obviously, we would love to have sponsors. If any ones at a company that think you might be interested in being a sponsor of the podcast, but we don't have any, so we don't have a budget for promotion, and have been doing this strictly through social media, and it's worked pretty well. And so anyway, with that, I guess we're done here. Our work is done for this week, and we'll get back on this next month, late in the month, and I'll put out a notice on LinkedIn when we're going to do it. And I really appreciate it, Jason. Thank you, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Well, thank you. You too.
Thanks, everyone.